Hey, it's Joel Duff. Welcome back to my channel. I put together this PowerPoint, more than a month ago, right during peak fall season, and I fully intended to record uh, some thoughts I had, some things that I thought about when I was taking a walk and watching the leaves fall and thinking about how, just love the smell and the feel of fall. Now fall's past and all the leaves are gone and it's gray and rainy today, but that's okay. I love the seasons. I love the changes, right? I don't like the same thing all the time. I've lived in San Diego and that was pretty much the same thing all the time. And that same thing is pretty nice, but I still appreciate having the changes. I like cold, I like hot, I like changes in color, organisms doing different things. I mean, all that to me is, the spice of life, a lot more diversity, a lot of different feelings. And I'm saying that because that brings me around to what I was thinking. Yeah, one day I was walking the dog and, I was looking at these trees and this question came to my mind. And again, you're probably not going to be surprised to hear that this type of question comes to my mind. I thought to myself, would Adam and Eve have ever witnessed a scene like this? Would Adam and Eve ever have experienced fall conditions? Beautiful yellow and orange leaves. Would they have experienced winter? Would it have snowed? Would they have experienced those changes? And there's been a variety of different responses to this by Christian theologians and other Christians who have thought about this particular question. It's really a question of, in the young earth creationist model of origins, where the world is only 6 to 10,000 years old and God has created all things within the space of 6 days and very good, and this whole definition of what does very good mean? And many young earth creationists take this to be a perfect creation, right? A creation with no death, of any sort. Now, of course, to say any sort, I mean, what about these leaves falling off the trees? I mean, that brings us back around to the question about leaves falling from the trees. Those are dying cells, at least. The trees aren't necessarily dying, but parts of the trees are dying. Now, most young earth creationists wouldn't count leaves as leaf death as death, or even whole trees dying as being dying, because they don't consider that true nefesh, or the living flesh. And so life and death mean a little bit, have a biblical definition versus maybe our scientific understanding of that. So maybe even insects and worms and jellyfish and so forth might not actually be alive in a biblical sense. And so maybe they died, decayed, there's fungi during decay. So, but the question still presents itself as, what was that original Edenic state, right? In this worldview of there's a perfect Edenic state or a very good Edenic state. Was that a single location on Earth? Was that the whole Earth? All right. So you could say, well, you've got the Garden of Eden, and in the Garden of Eden, there are special conditions, right? And actually, remember we're saying the Garden of Eden. There's a land of Eden in which there's a garden that is planted, and Adam is created, according to Genesis, outside of the garden and then placed inside the garden. So that then begs the question: if Adam is produced outside the garden, would the conditions have been different outside the garden? Obviously, if there's a garden and there's an outside of the garden, there has to be something that distinguishes the two. And then once you're in the garden, was the garden a place of no seasons? So let's take a look at that question of seasons. I'm going to work through some pictures here. By the way, every photograph here that I'm sharing is my photography from the last 6 or 7 years. So I've done a lot of photography, which includes going out and setting up and waiting for long periods of time for just the right conditions, taking a lot of pictures, doing a lot of post-processing. At one time I really enjoyed that process, and that enjoyment has rubbed off a little. I'm busier doing other things, but it's not just that. It's also the whole AI business, being able to generate lots of images very easily. And then just cell phones have gotten a whole lot better. So like pretty much anybody can pick up a cell phone and take a pretty decent picture and at least share it on sort of a screen this size. Unless you're watching this on a big screen, in which case, if you are playing this on full resolution, which I highly recommend, these images are fairly dense in terms of pixels, so a little better than a cell phone shot. And so all the photography I'm going to show you, this is the real deal, and this is all my photography. So yeah, I've enjoyed the fall. I picked out a bunch of fall images. So back to our question: would Adam and Eve, had they not been kicked out of the Garden of Eden, or even after being kicked out of the Garden of Eden and being in Eden, would they have experienced seasons? Would they have experienced dramatic changes? Because I was thinking, if there are seasons, especially if there's winter time, right? Were there ice caps, right, at the North and South Pole? So were there dramatically different climates in the original creation? How do organisms, especially living organisms, how are they going to, what kind of adaptations did they have? They have special adaptations to all these different, seasons in the original creation. All right, let's get to it. Let's look at a couple responses from young Earth creationists. This is from Answers in Genesis. I just cut out a small blurb from an article. It's actually very difficult to find much discussion on this topic. In fact, I often complain that young Earth creationists spend very little time, maybe they do behind closed doors, but they don't write much and they don't talk much about the original creation other than in very broad general terms about it being very good and perfect and everything was idyllic, right? Nobody harmed each other. There was the animals were all placid and so forth, right? But they don't really get into, and the assumption is that they were the same all over the earth, which means if there was winter time or a northern hemisphere ice cap, were there polar bears? And what did polar bears eat if they didn't eat, fish, which has maybe nefesh or are truly living things? How could they survive? Oh, we could go down a whole lot of rabbit holes here, but let's just stick to leaves falling off trees and fall and seasons. Were there seasons? So here's Answers in Genesis, just talking about the wonders of the fall, right? So I found an article. It was like, isn't fall wonderful, right? Fall is a work of God's creation. All right. So if it's a work of God's creation, you think that they would think that means God made the original organisms prepared for different seasons. I'm not sure that's actually what they mean. Let's put it this way. Green has a way of hogging the spotlight for most of the year. This is a very temperate climate perspective, right? Not a tropical forest living in Brazil where green is all year round, right? There really isn't a season in which it's not green. There's no fall there. So there are places in the world today which there's no fall. There are tropical climates where there's dry and wet seasons, and sometimes leaves drop their leaves during the dry season, but they generally don't turn beautiful colors. They just turn brown and shrivel up and fall off. You see, during spring and summer, leaves focus on the green side of God's work. Leaves focus on the green side of the work God designed them to do. This thin, energy-producing wonders take a carbon dioxide and sunshine and produce sugars and oxygen. But the energy production called photosynthesis wouldn't happen without tiny little biomolecules called chlorophylls. Yes. That brings us to an important question. Why would God hide such beautiful colors in leaves? Why not just let them be red and yellow all year round? I mean, they're beautiful colors. Why hide them behind green? And this is a very science-y answer, right? Our wise creator gave plants very efficient systems for making energy. Green leaves, which are darker color, do the best job of gathering the sunlight. That's why dark clothes get warmer quickly, right? Meaning you're absorbing more energy from the sun, right? That's what pigments do, absorb that energy. And they, in this case, in the case of your clothes, they're releasing it as heat again, and so you feel your clothes warming up because it's converting that electromagnetic spectrum, striking you into heat. All right, but when you mix all the colors together in one leaf, they work to absorb even more light over all the spectrum. All right, so yes, you have a whole bunch of different pigments that absorb reds, pigments that absorb yellows, pigments that absorb blues. Right, you absorb all these different color wavelengths, except for green. Right, green actually is not used by plants, and that's why you see them as green, because the light, which has all the colors in it, right, all the primary colors in white light, strikes the plant gobbles up all the energy from all the other colors of the spectrum except for green, and green is either transmitted through the leaf or reflects off the leaf into your eye, and you're like, I see green. So green leaves mean that there's pigments that are absorbing all the other wavelengths. But then in the fall, leaves hide, they're not hiding their true colors anymore. Meaning, all they mean by this is that some of the pigments that absorb some of the wavelengths begin to decay. And there's other pigments still remain, and they're absorbing different wavelengths. And so not just green light is reflected, but also red and maybe oranges and like some other combinations that create the colors that we see in the fall. So quick article here, answers to Genesis. Yes, amazing. Like fall colors are amazing because God made them that way. Well, okay, so God made them that way, but do they mean that God originally made them in the original instantaneous creation? He made those plants that way such that there would be fall colors. But what if there was never a season? What if it just was warm all the time? Well, then I think that they would say, well, yeah, they just stay green all the time, and you never got to see those colors, which ironically means that in their model, Adam's sin, which brought changes to the world, potentially changes to and creation of seasons, resulted in the leaves changing colors, giving us all these beautiful colors that would never have been seen before had Adam not sinned. Let's make this a little more complicated. Let me just show you how there's a kind of a diversity of thought by different Christians who have wondered about this topic. I just grabbed this from a website, a website by a creationist trying to explain different aspects of the world, and very few talk about this subject, so I'm kind of reliant on a few of these. But this captured the essence of what I get a feeling from talking to a lot of young earth creationists. It doesn't say in the Bible exactly how God made the seasons. Some will dispute that. We'll look at a couple of verses in a minute. Only that there's no seasons per se before Genesis 8:21 to 22. All right, so this author thinks that Genesis 8:21 to 22 shows that there were no seasons, right, before Noah's flood. God's proclamation of the nature of the world to follow in the aftermath of the great flood. That's what Genesis 8:21-22 is talking about. I am no expert in planetary mechanics, but I believe that I'm correct to say that it is the angle of the tilt of the axis on which the Earth rotates that provides the specifics of the seasonal differences and climatic zones. Yes, you're not a planetary mechanics expert, but you are right about this. It is the inclination of the Earth and going around the sun, and how it is different parts of the Earth are leaning into the sun at different times of the year, changing the total amount of energy received on different parts of the Earth at different times of the year. Now, even if the Earth was straight up and down, perpendicular with respect to the sun, and went around and didn't have any tilt at all, you would still have it colder toward the poles and hotter, in the equator. So you would have different temperature regimes, but you wouldn't necessarily have changes in those temperature regimes. So you wouldn't have changing seasons. Now to this author, and this is what I've seen many people say, or what many people think. Before the flood, there's no rainbows. You could, yes, that is a plain reading of the scripture that God sets his rainbow doesn't necessarily mean there was no rainbow. It's just like maybe he's giving a purpose to a rainbow, or making a promise through giving a something you're supposed to think about when you see a rainbow after the flood. But for this author, he's reading very literalistically, and he's saying there weren't any rainbows before the flood. There were long lifespans. There was no fermentation. He believes there's no breakdown of things. Basically, not much entropy happening. And no seasons. One can certainly hypothesize that when the Lord judged the earth with the great flood, he also changed the tilt of the axis and the alteration, which might explain all of the above. Though differences in temperature, light, and refractive angles, increases in penetration of cosmic radiation. So, right, so he's saying maybe the season started because during the flood it caused the axis to tilt. And I've heard many young earth creationists suggest this. Literally, the earth shifted with the advent of the global flood. The Lord had, of course, already cursed the ground. Really, Genesis 8:21-22 is saying, I will never again diminish or worsen the earth in its condition. So he made it a lot worse at the flood, but he's not going to make it any worse than that. This is the curse, all right, but the language indicates much more of a one-time effect during the flood. Like this is like a big event, special moment in time, and then I promise I'm not going to make any other changes. I'm going to keep the seasons as they are going forward. This interpretation of finding climate changing even in the language of 821 is strengthened by the fact that verse 22 really says this: from this time forward, all the days of the earth shall be the 4 seasons. From these two verses, definitely link a new development of the seasons with some diminution in the earth's former quality. All right, so that kind of gives you one flavor of one type of thinking. That, no, there weren't any seasons. Yeah, it was all just the same all year round. And I think this goes to a common, just the average person who's never thought of these topics before. And you kind of ask this question. I was like, well, wait a second. Adam, Eve, they were naked. They were provided all this fruit. They're wandering around, and they visualize like this lush area, like there's fruit trees, and you're picking the fruits and just eating them and kind of lounging around. Even though God says he has work for them, supposed to keep the garden, guard the garden from what? Right? From the evil chaos that's outside of it, which suggests there's something different going on, or there is another environment. And they were to name all the animals. All right, they have jobs to do. This isn't just a lay back and they're on a sunset cruise all 24 hours a day. But I think the conception that many Christians have is a simplistic conception of everything would just be the same. Like the fruit trees would continue to grow, the animals were just like hanging out, and we're just sort of frolicking around. And then sin happens, and then somehow that changes everything, right? The animals change, the plants change, and now like there's even seasons, all right? I'm going to have to deal with, it's going to get cold. I mean, it does get cold in the Holy Land, right? It snows there. If that's where the Garden of Eden was, in that particular location. Right, so just to remind you, so here is what Genesis 8:21-22 says. I think we kind of hit this already, but the Lord smelled the pleasing aroma. That is the sacrifices that Noah served up after getting off the ark and thanking God for preserving him. I will never again curse the ground because of man, for the intention of man's heart is evil in his youth. Neither again will I strike down every living creature as I've done, while the earth remains, seed time and harvest, cold and heat, summer and winter, day and night shall not cease. I promise to maintain the continuity of the way that the world operates, going forward. All right. So, but the key words for us here are seed time and harvest, cold and heat. What about Genesis 2:5-6? Let's go back a little bit earlier. Now, this hits another idea that is kind of an older idea that is lost some favor even among young earth creationists. But that is that the world was under some kind of canopy. And so it was like a very constant environment all the way up to Noah's flood. So there wouldn't have been any seasons. There weren't even, there wasn't really any differences, obvious differences between seasons. For the Lord God had not caused it to rain on the earth. Is the idea that it didn't even rain before the flood. And there was no man to till the ground, but a mist went up from the earth and watered the whole face of the ground. Interesting. The whole face of the ground. And for young earth creationists, since they take everything to be speaking about the globe, right? The whole earth, rather than an area or the land or what's known area. That would mean that they view that the whole earth is being watered by this mist coming up from the ground. This is a couple of residences just across the street from where my kids go to school. And so a couple mornings, after dropping them off, I would do some photography here in the fall. All right, what about this article by Henry Morris? Now, this is back in 2004. Henry Morris is the founder. Well, actually, this is Henry Morris, I think. And this might be the original Henry Morris, not his sons. And he's the founder of Institute for Creation Research, prominent young earth creationist. And so he's asking the question, summer and winter. And here's this first, Zechariah 14:8, and it shall be in the day, the living water shall go out from Jerusalem, half of them toward the former sea, half toward the hinder sea. In summer and winter shall it be. And he notes in his commentary, it's interesting that there's no mention of either spring or fall, as such, anywhere in the Bible. Though there are several references to summer and winter. Well, you know what? In Palestine, in the Levant region, Israel, there's not really much of a fall in spring. It's really a rainy season and a dry season. There's sort of a colder time, and there's summer is obviously hot. It can get cold in the winter, but there isn't a dramatic change in terms of this transition, in terms of the coloration of there isn't like a fall season, right? There's a harvest season, but that's not like right between summer and winter. And this is true for a lot of other places on earth, so we're, again, I'm in Ohio, so we have seasons, whereas in Florida, the seasons aren't nearly as dramatic, right, as they are here in Ohio. And you don't really think of it. It's kind of like they often refer to, winter or like the cooler months, and then suddenly it's summer, right? There's not like this, the spring flowers and all the things we associate with the changes from the harsh winter season to the summer. There's apparently no formulaic calendar period in either spring or autumn, and the cultural accepted periods vary from country to country. Yeah, we have different conceptions of that because the climate is different. In any case, we do know that there have been so-called seasons from the very beginning. Henry Morris is convinced that there has been seasons right from the beginning. I think he means like the beginning, and God creates in 6 days and boom, there's going to be seasons. Owing to the Earth's axial tilt. See, he's accepting that there was an axial, like the tilt that's here today was the tilt then. I'm not sure how he knows that. The Bible doesn't say that the Earth is tilted at a certain number of degrees. Right? Doesn't say it's changed. Doesn't say it was the same. Doesn't refer to the tilt at all. So that's a big assumption. I know Henry Morris wasn't there. All right. He wasn't there to see it, and he doesn't have a report of it. So I'm just mimicking Ken Ham. Can Henry Morris really say that? He says, we know this. All right. We know that there have been so-called seasons owing to the Earth's axial tilt. But I would claim he can't know that. I feel like pretty confident the tilt has been pretty similar in the past. But we know the tilt actually slightly changes and the precession changes and so forth, right? There are changes, but there are changes over hundreds of thousands and millions of years. Speaking of the sun, moon, and stars, when he created them, God said, here's the key phrase. The whole video is really about this. Okay. Let them be for signs and for seasons, for days and years. He thinks that's I got it. Duh. Of course there were seasons. Or actually, the day he's creating the sun, moon, and the stars, he says, here's what they're for, right? I'm going to give them function. Here's the purpose. Here's why I've created the sun, the moon, and the stars. They're going to be for signs, seasons, for days, and years. How do you know what a day is? Because of the sun, right? How do you know what a year is? Because you're going to note the travel around the sun a single time. Actually, how would you know you've gone around the sun one time if there wasn't a tilt, all right? If there was no tilt and you were the same distance away from the sun, you're going around in a perfect circle. Some creationists think that it was a circle originally and not an ellipse, right? We're actually moving farther and closer to the sun, which also changes our seasons. But if you're going around a circle and you had no tilt, how would you know you finished off a year? Well, I guess if you're really good at looking at the stars, you would notice the star patterns would come around. And every 365 days, you get back to the same pattern of stars in the sky. Although that would be still pretty hard to tell when you don't have any tilt going on. So anyway, but the point is that here Henry Morris is certain that there were seasons because Genesis 1:14 says that God created them for seasons. I got a big problem with this. It doesn't take a whole lot of searching, a whole lot of thinking, a whole lot of work with looking at the Hebrew word here and doing some checks with how that word is used in other locations to find out that the word seasons here is not referring to summer and winter, right? It's referring to the liturgical seasons, right? Of when there's going to be events, right? That you're doing, like the Passover, all these different events in the life of the Israelites. Those are what the seasons are that they care about. How do I know what season it's going to be? Well, it's the season for this event or that, of the Feast of the Booths or whatever. All right, so all of those things are the things that are being determined by looking at the sun, the moon, and the stars to know at what point in the year you are for that particular season. Some of those things are associated with harvest, right? And that's a really important moments in time. But it's not really talking about like seasons like you and I are thinking about, winter and summer. Okay, yeah. So here's Genesis 1:14-19. Let the lights of the firmament of the heaven be there to divide the day from the night. Let them be for signs, for seasons, for days, and for years. Again, those seasons aren't necessarily like the physical like changes in temperature. All right, these are more of cultural seasons to be noted. There's a house on the way again to dropping off my kids at school. It's just about a mile from my home, and there are certain times of the year where the lighting is just right at this place. Amish country, right? About 30 minutes south. We have a very large population of Amish here in this part of Ohio. I'd love to drive down there during fall, sometimes spring, and see all the different farms down there. So here we have an Amish farm. They're collecting their stalks of corn. More Amish country, right? Somewhat hilly, which is nice. This is Wingfoot Lake. This is about 4 or 5 miles from my house. This is a place I love to go for sunsets and for sunrises. In this case, I'm there right at sunrise, and Wingfoot Lake is a state park in Ohio. And across this lake is the home of the Goodyear blimp. And so I've been there many times when they're pulling it out and they're going to take off and fly over the Akron area for the aerial views there. And so it's kind of cool to see the Goodyear blimp there. I have other images but not from the fall, of the Goodyear blimp coming down and landing over here. This is the same lake, Wingfoot Lake, in the fall. Love that spot. Another location about 25 minutes south. It's in a game reserve. And so it's accessible, but not very well known. There's several different little waterfalls back in there. Really great place to go in the fall. Yeah, and this is just on the campus of University of Akron, which is where I work. That's the student center. All right, Joel, where were you going with all this? Like, what was the big deal? It's just one of those things where I'm just processing through my mind what do the variations that we see in the world around us tell us about God's creation, about how He's made His creation, how it operates, and fall colors, changes in seasons seem like it's hard for me to imagine that not being part of that original world. Whether you believe that God created everything in an instant over 6 days, that it's very young. Even so, when it's like, here's the animals and here's the plants and here's human beings, and they're set in the garden, um, it feels like these types of thing changes that would have occurred to the world. How could they not have occurred? Right? If there's a tilt to the earth and it's going to get cold and then it's going to get hot, the temperatures are going to change, then the organisms are going to have to be adapted to those changes. And they're going to have to change their behaviors, and they're going to have to, in some cases, maybe migrate. And you've got Adam and Eve, and if they're naked, um, what was God's original plan for them if they hadn't sinned and they were going to run around naked, right? Were they gonna make clothes? Or were they just oblivious to the cold? Because after all, they couldn't die, right? The animals couldn't die. And then I've talked about this in other videos. Why did they, why do animals that today are predators, they have eyes out front, right? So they can, be focused on their prey and they're not so concerned about being eaten. And why do rabbits have eyes on the sides of their heads, right? And ears that can listen. What would they have to listen for? Right? If they couldn't die, right? If there's no death, why would they have any fear? They wouldn't worry about being eaten by a fox, in which case they don't have to be attentive. They can just be munching on the grass. So what would be the purpose of having eyes on the side of the head? Why not in the front of the head? I mean, front of the head means you can have binocular vision, which seems like a whole lot nicer form of vision. And so when you look at the parts of creation, like the different traits the organisms have, as you think about those traits, you're like, you know what that trait's for? That trait is for, protecting itself against being caught. And that trait is for catching something and eating it, right? Those teeth and that gut system they have is meant to eat meat, not meant to eat plants. And so as you go through each trait, you're like, yeah, everything seems to actually be made, or if you want to use the word designed for a world that's dynamic and changing, and you have to be ready for, each organism has its place and its role in that particular ecosystem. But in a perfect paradise, if the whole world is perfect, then what do those traits mean? What are they for? Are they just accoutrements, right? You're like, oh, fancy term, accoutrements. Are they just features that they have that are just variants that don't have any function? It's like, I've got this huge rack, a male deer. I got this huge thing I'm carrying around in my head because it's pretty. I don't use it for anything. Because I don't have to battle. I don't have to fight with other, males to try to get a mate. There's no aggression here. There's no fighting. There's no winners and losers. So why do I have those? Then we could go down 100,000 traits of organisms, all of which in today's context, I would say, oh, that's because of this. That's why they have that, because it helps them preserve themselves in this environment. It gives them a survival advantage. But in a world where there's no death, you don't need any of those characters. And so you could say, well, they were just there just to be pretty, just to add variety. Or you have to say that they're there because God knew that Adam was going to fail the challenge and bring about chaos. And those animals were going to have to start using them, right? So you're going to make rabbits that have all the features necessary to help them survive in a world where things are trying to eat them. And they didn't need them in the original creation, but he knew that he was going to need them like a couple days later after they were created. And then that's why they have those characteristics. Okay, so bringing that back around to plants and leaves. If there were no seasons, like some people believe, and so leaves didn't fall off trees, but God might have made the original trees just like those original carnivores with all the features for carnivory. So they made all the plants for features that would be in wintertime. And then when wintertime came because of Adam's sin, they were ready for it, prepared, even though they never would have needed those in the original creation. That's just a really complicated way to think about the world. A very complicated way to think about the world. That all of this creation, in fact, the whole entire universe was created for a particular purpose, which lost its purpose after the eighth day, if Adam sinned on the eighth day, or even the seventh day. So it only lasted a day or two. And then everything was corrupted, because young earth creationists believe the entire universe was affected by Adam's sin. That stars now go supernova that they wouldn't have before. And so every feature of the universe is different. Again, like, was the whole earth just one big happy family? Or were there if Adam had been traveled, he didn't sin, and he eventually, works his way to extend the garden or leaves the garden, although the whole idea is that he's never going to leave the garden. All right, I really think that the picture in mind is Adam successfully guarding the garden. And then as he has offspring, he's pushing the walls of the garden out, right? He's going to make the garden into the whole world, make the whole world into a garden, a cultivated place. But he's totally unsuccessful at that. And therefore the outside world creeps into the garden. Well, he's actually cast out of the garden, but eventually the garden is lost because he can never return. And the outside world, the chaos of the outside world eventually destroys that Garden of Eden. We don't have the Garden of Eden anymore. But in that particular model, the rest of the world is a place where there is, organisms are competing for resources, where there's seasons, where there's winter and summer, right? And Adam is in that world now and has to adapt to that. I just wanted to show you some pretty pictures, and because it's wintertime now, if you're watching this soon after I've done this video, if you're watching this next year during fall, well then, hey, here's some pretty fall pictures from Ohio. Enjoy the leaves, if you still have some. Hey, and if you're in Florida, enjoy your green leaves still. It's like beauty comes in many different forms. And, many people just love the fall. They love that change, and it's like, feels so beautiful. I think part of the beauty is the change. Let's face it, if the leaves were yellow, 356 days a year, and that's just the way the world was, God made all trees with yellow leaves instead, yeah, we'd say yellow leaves were amazing. But you actually get kind of tired of the same thing. That's what I'm saying. It's the spice of life to have variation and change. All right, a world with no change, a world with no challenges, a world with no diversity like this is not nearly as interesting. So I appreciate the fall, love the fall leaves. Hope you enjoyed that too. Share your thoughts in the comments. Like, what have you heard people say? I'd be really interested to hear like what your impressions, if you're a Christian, what have you ever thought about the garden, and whether, like, what it was like? Would there have been a fall season? Would the leaves have fallen off the trees? Would animals have hibernated? Would the birds that were there migrate somewhere else? What do you think? Let me know. And I'll see you when I see you. Bye-bye.